Good day. So for this lecture, we'll talk about how the body controls our temperature. And later on, we'll apply these concepts in clinical setting. Okay. So before we go into the physiology of thermoregulation, let's talk about the physics of heat loss. So normally, everything that surrounds us, our bodies, uh, the objects that surround us, they emit some form of heat, or heat is transferred out into the environment. Now, there are three ways by which heat is transferred into the environment, namely radiation, conduction, and evaporation. So if you look at the diagram here, everything in this picture actually will transfer heat going to the environment. Now, take note, this is at room temperature. When we talk about room temperature, this is around 25 degrees Celsius. So at room temperature, our body emits heat mostly in the form of infrared heat rays. So majority of heat loss from our body is via radiation in the form of infrared heat. Now, next to that would be conduction. So this is through contact, no? That's why when you feel your seat, no? For example, you will notice that your seat is a little bit warm. So our bodies will now transfer heat into the objects where we are in contact with. Now, there's a special kind of conduction called convection. So when we talk of convection, this is particularly true for water and air molecules. So for example, uh, our bodies are surrounded by a layer of air molecules. So through contact, our skin will transfer this heat to the air molecules that surround our body. No? So that's through conduction. So when that happens, the kinetic motion or the Brownian movement of these air molecules that surround our body will increase. No? So as the kinetic motion increases because of heat, they will slowly move away, and then they will be replaced by a new set of air molecules. So that's convection. So heat is lost through that method. Now, if you will notice, should the rate of turnover increases, so for example, during the summer days, we prefer to stand in front of a fan, no? So this increases the rate of turnover of the air molecules that surround our body. So that increases the cooling effect. No? So heat is easily transferred from our body to the air molecules. This is also true for water. So for example, if you sit in a tub of water which is still or not moving, no, and you compare that to, let's say, taking a shower, rate of transfer or rate of heat transfer is faster or higher when water is moving. So for example, if you're taking a shower, then rate of heat transfer is faster that way compared to, let's say, you're sitting in a tub, no? Now, the third method is via evaporation. Now, for every gram of water, there's around 0.58 kilocalories of energy or heat lost into the environment. Now, there are two ways by which heat is transferred to the environment via evaporation. So one is through insensible losses. So these are this is the water vapor that we don't typically notice. So for example, when we breathe, when we talk, some water molecules escape our body. So this is insensible heat loss, no, or water or evaporation. So that's around 16 to 19 kilocalories per hour. However, if the environment is warmer, no, we will sweat more. And by sweating more, we increase the rate of heat loss via evaporation. So, for example, if skin temperature is greater than environmental temperature, meaning the environment is cold, then majority of heat loss is via radiation, no, 60%. And convection. Now, if skin temperature is less than environmental temperature, so meaning the environment is warm, most especially during the summer days, we will sweat more, then heat loss via evaporation becomes higher. However, if skin temperature is equal to environmental temperature, then there is no heat loss or heat gain. Now, clothes will alter the rate of heat transfer from our body to the environment. So clothes typically increase the private zone of air around our body, and this will reduce air convection. No? So this will reduce convection, and it will reduce heat loss. But of course, this will now depend on the material of the fabric and the design of the fabric. So for example, during the cold months, we typically wear sweater. No, if you go into colder countries, you will often see sweaters or jackets that are lined with, let's say, aluminum. So these are thermal wear. No, so those are the clothing suited for those kinds of environment. For warmer environments naman, like for example, during the summer days, we typically would wear like sando, no, cotton, light shirt, things like that. So the material and the design will uh, affect the rate of heat loss, no, from our body to the environment. Now, water has a high specific heat. So when we talk about specific heat, this is the energy required in order to increase the temperature of 1 gram of water. No, so that's what specific heat means. Now, since water has a high specific heat, this simply means we need tremendous amounts of energy just to increase the temperature of water. So this is the reason why water is an excellent coolant. And if clothes get wet, this will now increase the rate of heat loss. No? So that increases the conductivity or the heat transfer from our body to the clothes by around 20 times. So that's how we transfer heat from our body to the environment. Now let's look at body temperature. So when we talk about body temperature, we actually mean two kinds of temperature: core temperature and skin temperature. So when we talk about core temperature, this is the temperature, as the name implies, found in the innermost portions of our body. Now, this has to be kept constant. It has to be kept constant. So that's around 36 to 37.5. Now, this core temperature is more clinically relevant compared to skin temperature. Now, in the hospital or in the clinics, when we monitor for vital signs, it is imperative that we take the temperature of our patient. So what we typically use, if you know what a thermal gun is, no? So a thermal gun, if you have seen one, this typically detects the temperature of the tympanic membrane. So that's aural, A-U-R-A-L, aural temperature. So that more or less reflects core temperature. Other ways of getting your core temperature is through oral or rectal readings. So these are the ways by which we get core temperature. For skin temperature, this is, as the name implies, this is the temperature of our skin. Now, this fluctuates depending on the environment. So if the environment is cold, our skin temperature, most especially in the more distal portions of our body, will be lower. If the environmental temperature is high, it's warm, then our skin temperature may increase. So skin temperature fluctuates. So one example of this is, for example, when you stand under the sun for a few minutes and then you get your skin temperature, you will expect that skin temperature will be a little bit higher, but that does not mean you have fever. No, if you just cool down under a shade, then skin temperature will go back to normal. So skin temperature fluctuates with environmental temperature. Okay, so how is heat produced by the body? Now, core temperature is basically due to the metabolism and the chemical reactions found or that's occurring within the cells of our body. More notably, the skeletal muscles, the visceral organs like the heart, brain, liver. So all of these organs, no, will have their basal metabolic rate, and then they are responsible for generating the core temperature. Of course, the metabolism of these cells will be highly dependent on certain hormones. Primary to that would be the thyroid hormone. So we all know that the thyroid hormone controls our metabolism. Other hormones, of course, you have your testosterone, growth hormone, and catecholamines. So all of these hormones can affect the generation of our core temperature. Now, we also have thermogenic effect of food. So when we talk about thermogenic effect of food, if we recall, whenever ATP is broken down, no, heat is liberated. And during the breakdown of food, no, the chemical breakdown of food within the cells, ATP is utilized. So whenever foodstuffs are broken down chemically within the cells and we use ATP, then heat is liberated. So that's thermogenic effect of food. So that's how we produce core temperature. Now, this core temperature will have to be conducted, no, from the core going to the skin. So two factors will play an important role for that. You have the insulator system of our body. So this is the adipose tissue and blood flow to the skin. So both of these factors will control or will determine the rate of transfer of heat from the core going to the skin. And from the skin, heat is lost into the environment, again, via radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Now, looking at the transfer of heat from the core to the skin, as what we've mentioned, we have two ways. First, you have the insulator system. So this is essentially the amount of adipose tissue we have. So the more adipose tissue we have, the more insulated we are. That's why if you will compare people residing in the more northern or southern parts of the globe, no, close to the north and south poles, so those areas are colder. They have more body fat compared to their counterparts within the tropical region. So this is the insulator system. So it said that fat or adipose tissue conducts only around 33%, no, compared to other tissue. The more important one would be the blood flow to the skin. So this is your arteriovenous anastomosis. So if you will notice, no, since they are blood vessels, they have smooth muscles that will enable these blood vessels to dilate or constrict. So typically, if the environment is cold, then blood vessels will constrict. So this will reduce blood flow to the skin, preserving now core temperature. However, if environmental temperatures are warm, then blood vessels will dilate. This will allow more blood to go to the skin in order to transfer heat from the core going to the skin. So in this diagram, you will notice the conductance, no, plotted against environmental temperature. So whenever the environment is cold, then blood vessels constrict. However, in warmer conditions, blood vessels will dilate. Now, if you compare the blood flow to the skin with the insulator system, the blood flow to the skin or the arteriovenous sinuses is said to be the more effective method of regulating heat transfer from the core going to the skin. Okay, now let's look at the hypothalamus. So in this diagram, you will notice several nuclei. So all of these will have important vegetative function. So this is the reason why the hypothalamus is said to be the highest center in the central nervous system, because it controls all, no, if not majority of our vegetative function. Without the hypothalamus, we will die. Now, in the hypothalamus, you have the nuclei that will control body temperature. We have the posterior hypothalamic region and the posterior preoptic and anterior hypothalamic region. Now, let's focus more on the posterior preoptic and anterior hypothalamus. So if you will notice, these nuclei are responsible for heat-losing mechanisms. So whenever the body detects a warm temperature, the posterior preoptic anterior hypothalamic region is activated, and they now activate heat-losing mechanism. Like for example, sweating, panting, and inhibition of thyroid hormone release. So this will allow the body to dissipate heat, no, just to maintain core temperature. So one of the more important functions of the posterior preoptic anterior hypothalamic region is to activate the sweating mechanism. So this is your sweat gland. No? Recall that the sweat gland is only activated by the sympathetic nervous system. It does not contain parasympathetic fibers. So it is only activated by the sympathetic nervous system, namely the sympathetic cholinergic division. So the neurotransmitter being used by the sweat gland would be acetylcholine. It may be activated by catecholamines, but its main neurotransmitter would be acetylcholine. So it stimulates muscarinic receptors, no? And when that happens, the gland will now produce the primary secretion. So this primary secretion is said to be a protein-free fluid similar to plasma. So just like the nephron, in the nephron, di ba, you have your glomerulus, the filtrate coming from the glomerulus or the filtration barrier is said to be protein-free. It's similar or identical to plasma, except it will not contain plasma proteins. So the same is true for your primary secretion. Now, this fluid will pass through the ducts. Now, the ducts, just like the tubular cells of the nephron, they are responsible for reabsorbing sodium chloride and water. So it modifies the primary secretion before this fluid comes out as sweat onto the skin. No? So that's how you produce sweat. Now, if sympathetic stimulation is low, no, mababa, then the amount of primary secretion would be less. Since it is less, no, or the volume is low, the flow of your primary secretion as it goes through the ducts will be slow, mabagal. This will now allow the ductal cells, or the ductal cells will now have more time to reabsorb sodium, chloride, and water. So when sweat comes out, no, less fluid, less sodium, less chloride will be found in the sweat. You have greater concentrations of potassium, lactate, and urea. So I'm sure many of us or all of you have experienced when we sweat, it's a little bit sticky. Sometimes it smells a little bit sour. So that's the quality of sweat when sympathetic stimulation is low. However, if sympathetic stimulation is high, so for example, when you exercise, no? So the amount of primary secretion would be greater, it's higher. Since it is greater, then the flow of your primary secretion as it passes through the ducts will be faster. Less time for the ductal cells to reabsorb sodium, chloride, and water. So when sweat comes out onto the skin, so you'll have more water, more sodium, and more chloride. No? The sweat becomes less salty, more fluid. So I'm sure you've experienced this. For example, when you jog or when you exercise, you profusely sweat. So that's the quality of the sweat if sympathetic stimulation is high. Now, this is particularly true if the sweat gland is unacclimatized. So when we talk about acclimatization of sweat glands, aldosterone is responsible for this. No? So if you will recall, the role of aldosterone is to maintain extracellular fluid volume. So several organs will be targeted by aldosterone. So primary to this, of course, you have the nephron. along the gastrointestinal tract. Of course, you have the intestine, the salivary glands, and here you have the sweat glands as well. So the sweat glands will respond to aldosterone, increasing now reabsorption of sodium, chloride, and water. Of course, just like the nephron, the trade-off will be the same. Aldosterone will increase sodium reabsorption. However, the trade-off is potassium losses. So whenever aldosterone is present, and when we sweat a lot, no, the sweat glands are acclimatized, then more potassium is lost, no, through sweat. So this is the reason why you have your sports drink. So you have your Gatorade, Powerade, Pocari Sweat. So whenever we sweat a lot, it is important for us to replace our electrolytes, no, and fluids. Okay. The other nucleus is the posterior hypothalamic region. Now, the posterior hypothalamus, if you will notice, it is responsible for heat conserving mechanisms. So they are activated when the environmental temperature is low. So kapag malamig. So notice that whenever the environment is cold, no, the posterior hypothalamus is activated. So shivering happens, piloerection. Although piloerection for humans does not have a significant effect. And of course, vasoconstriction of blood vessels. So for example, if the body, no, detects temperature, so for example, cold or warm, so you have your warm receptors and cold receptors. So recall that we have more cold receptors in the body compared to warm receptors. These signals will be detected by thermoreceptors and then they will be sent to the hypothalamus. So warm signals will be carried by heat-sensitive neurons that will activate the posterior preoptic anterior hypothalamic nuclei, activating now heat-losing mechanisms such as sweating and vasodilation. For colder signals, they will be carried by cold-sensitive neurons going to the posterior hypothalamic region. When that happens, this will activate shivering and vasoconstriction, so heat-conserving mechanisms. Now, take note that the posterior hypothalamus makes central and peripheral signals. So both of these nuclei, no, or regions in the hypothalamus communicate with each other so that the appropriate response will be elicited. Now, the posterior hypothalamus has a more, shall we say, central role because its function is to integrate all central and peripheral signals, no? So that an appropriate response will be elicited. Okay. Now, the hypothalamus, its responsibility is to set our body temperature. So it will dictate the set point. So the hypothalamus sets the set point. So this is like the thermostat. So for example, if the hypothalamus says our body should be at 37 degrees Celsius, then the body will try to find ways in order to match the set point. So for example, the hypothalamus says, okay, our body temperature should be at 37 degrees. But if the body temperature is lower, you will notice you have more heat production, no? Such as vasoconstriction, piloerection, activation of the shivering mechanism, that's mechanical thermogenesis, and a release of thyroid hormones. And this is chemical thermogenesis. So those processes will increase whenever our body temperature is colder. So heat is produced in order to make the body temperature at 37 degrees. So it matches the set point. Similarly, if body temperature is warm, no, the hypothalamus will now activate heat-losing mechanisms such as vasodilation, sweating, and decreased chemical and mechanical thermogenesis. So evaporative heat loss increases. This will now bring the temperature down back to 37. So whatever the set point is, which is dictated by the hypothalamus, the body will try to find ways in order to match the set point. Okay, now let's look at thermogenesis. You have mechanical and chemical. First, you have mechanical thermogenesis. This is activated by the posterior hypothalamic nuclei. So the posterior hypothalamic nucleus or nuclei is said to be the primary motor for shivering. Ito yung giniginaw tayo, no? So this is inhibited by its counterpart, the anterior hypothalamic preoptic region, but activated by cold signals coming from the body, no? From the core and from the skin. So once cold, no, is detected by the body, so that will activate the posterior hypothalamic region. Signals will descend down the brainstem and into the spinal cord, increasing now the facilitation of the anterior motor neurons. So this increases the tone of the skeletal muscle, and it makes the muscle spindle and GTOs, the Golgi tendon organ, more sensitive, causing a feedback oscillation of the stretch and the inverse stretch reflex to oscillate. So if you will recall, the stretch and the inverse stretch, or the myotactic and inverse myotactic reflex, di ba? Whenever the muscle is stretched, so you activate the myotactic reflex. So whenever the muscle is stretched, the muscle spindle is activated. It sends action potentials to the spinal cord. And from the spinal cord, signals are sent back to the muscle, causing it to contract. So that's the myotactic reflex. Now, the moment your muscle contracts, this will tense the Golgi tendon organ, or the GTOs. This will now activate the inverse myotactic reflex. So when the GTO to the muscle, allowing the muscle to relax, no? So when the muscle relaxes, this will reactivate the muscle spindle, and then the myotactic reflex is activated again. So whenever the posterior hypothalamic region is activated, this will facilitate the anterior motor neurons, increasing a feedback oscillation of the myotactic and inverse myotactic reflex. So when that happens, you will notice that whenever the muscle relaxes, so it sends a feedback loop, no, causing it to contract. And when the muscle contracts, again, it will send a feedback loop, allowing the muscles to relax. Now, if the anterior horn cells are facilitated, so it causes oscillation of the myotactic and inverse myotactic reflex to occur, you will notice you now have a series of contractions and relaxations, no? So that's what's happening whenever the shivering mechanism is activated. And if you will recall your muscle physiology, whenever the muscle contracts, ATP is utilized. Whenever the muscle relaxes, ATP is utilized as well. And when ATP is broken down, heat is liberated, no? So that's mechanical thermogenesis. Now, for chemical thermogenesis, several substances, particularly hormones, will control the metabolic rate of our body, no? Primary to this would be the thyroid hormone. So the thyroid hormone is responsible for long-term heat production because it controls the metabolism of cells. Now, other hormones or other substances can also control our body temperature, no, via regulating metabolism. So, of course, you have your catecholamines, growth hormones, etc. Now, there's another substance called thermogenin. Thermogenin is found within brown adipose tissue or brown fat. Now, brown fat is more abundant among infants or neonates. No? Thermogenin is responsible for uncoupled oxidative phosphorylation. So what's uncoupled oxidative phosphorylation? If you will recall your biochemistry, when we have, let's say, carbohydrates or foodstuffs, whenever oxygen is present, they are chemically broken down, and you enter the Krebs cycle and you enter the electron transport chain in order to produce ATP. So that's your energy currency. And you have to break down ATP just to liberate heat. So that's your oxidative phosphorylation. When we talk about uncoupled oxidative phosphorylation, this bypasses the production of ATP. So foodstuffs immediately are metabolized just to produce heat. So you automatically produce heat instead of producing energy first or ATP first, no? Before it is broken down just to liberate heat. So that's your thermogenin. Now, they are more abundant among infants because if you will notice, no, if you go to the NICU, you will notice that neonates, no, they do not shiver, they do not sweat, simply because their hypothalamus is it's not yet properly developed. No, so what regulates their body temperature would be the adipose tissue or the brown adipose tissue, namely thermogenin. Of course, as these infants grow older, the hypothalamus gradually matures, so it develops. The hypothalamus now takes over in controlling the body temperature. And the brown adipose tissue slowly disappears. No? Now, older books will say adults, or we lose brown fat by around the age of 17 to 19. No? However, recent studies show that older adults would still have some brown fat in their bodies or in our bodies, but very insignificant compared to infants. Okay, now let's talk about the feedback gain. The feedback gain measures how effective a particular control system is. The greater the value of the feedback gain, the more efficient the control system is. So if you look at the feedback gain of thermoregulation, it is said that for every 28-degree change in environmental temperature, core temperature changes by 1 degree. No? So if you calculate the feedback gain, so that's the change in environmental temperature divided by change in core temperature minus 1, you'll get 27, which is fairly an efficient control system. No? If you read Guyton, Guyton compares the feedback gain of the thermoregulation and the baroreceptor reflex. So if you will recall, the baroreceptor reflex controls our blood pressure in a moment-to-moment basis. So this is due to autonomic function. Now, the feedback gain of the baroreceptor reflex is said to be less than 2. If you compare that to the thermoregulation of the body, it's 27. So notice that the baroreceptor reflex is not as efficient as thermoregulation. Okay, now let's look at the set point and how the set point regulates our body temperature. So first, let's look at sweating. So in this diagram, no, so this is the head temperature plotted against evaporative heat loss. No? So if you read your books, it is said that as skin temperature increases, the set point goes down. So they are inversely related. They are inversely related. Now, when skin temperature increases, no, sweating begins at a lower hypothalamic temperature. So the relationship is also inversely related. No? So what does that mean? So let's look at the diagram here. take note of three things. One, your skin temperature here. Second, this is the threshold for sweating. I've marked this with a black line. And the intersection between your sweat, this curve graph and your insensible evaporation. So the intersection is said to be the set point. Okay. So those are the three things that you need to take note of. Your skin temperature, the threshold for sweating, and your set point. Now, recall that the set point is being dictated by the hypothalamus. So for example, let's look at 32 degrees. So if the skin is at 32 degrees, the hypothalamus will set the set point at around, let's say, 36.9, this one. But if the skin is at 32 degrees, no, sweating, no, this one, the threshold for sweating begins at around 37.1. So this means that at 37.1 or greater, the body will sweat. So you will lose heat. That brings down the temperature to 36.9, this one. So if you will notice, that's how your body will lose heat just to match the set point. Now, what happens if body temperature increases, let's say to 39? You will notice that at 39 degrees, the set point is now around 36.7. No, here, this one. But the threshold for sweating is at 36 point, let's say 36.9. 36.9. So this means at 39 degrees, sweating will begin at 36.9. So you lose heat. Oh, sorry. You lose heat. This will now bring the temperature down to 36.7. So that's how, again, the body will try to control the temperature. So whatever the set point is, the body will try to match the set point. Now, let's look at these rules. So notice that as skin temperature increases from 32 to 39, the set point goes down. True enough. The set point goes down. And when temperature or when skin temperature is high, from 32 to 39, the threshold for sweating begins at a lower hypothalamic temperature. So that also follows the second rule. No? So that's how the hypothalamus regulates our temperature through sweating. Now let's look at shivering. The principles or the rules are the same. No? So as skin temperature increases, the set point goes down. Again, it's inversely related. When skin temperature is low, shivering begins at a normal or a higher hypothalamic temperature. So let's look at the examples here. So again, this is your head temperature and heat production. Take note again of three things. Your skin temperature, this one. The threshold for shivering, marked by the black vertical lines. And of course, your set point. Again, the set point is being dictated by the hypothalamus. So let's look at 24 degrees Celsius. So whenever the skin temperature is at 24 degrees Celsius, notice that the set point dictated by the hypothalamus is around 37.1, this one. But the threshold for shivering, no, the threshold for shivering begins at around 36.6. So this means if the temperature is at 36.6 or the hypothalamic temperature is 36.6, the person begins to shiver. So you now produce heat. You now produce heat in order to bring the temperature to the set point, 37.1. No? Now, what happens if the skin becomes colder. Let's say 20 degrees. So notice that the set point slightly increases. It slightly increases. No? Now let's look at 20 degrees. The threshold for shivering also increases. That's 36.9. So this means if the hypothalamic temperature is 36.9 or below, the person will start to shiver, no? So heat is produced. So that brings the temperature up to the set point, 37.1. No? So if you will notice, it also follows the rule. If the skin temperature increases, no, from 20 to 24, the set point goes down, no, inversely related. And similarly, if skin temperature goes down from 24 to 20, notice that the threshold for shivering increases. So it's inversely related as well. So that's the shivering mechanism. So both the sweating and shivering mechanisms, they are controlled mainly by the hypothalamus. Now, the spinal cord also has, to a certain degree, some control for thermoregulation. So these are your local reflexes or cord or spinal cord reflexes. This will mainly control localized areas. So for example, if you place an ice pack to a particular extremity, so that area will cause cutaneous vasoconstriction. No? Of course, the blood vessels in the entire body will not constrict, only that region. So that's a cord reflex. Similarly, if you place a warm compress to an extremity, so in that region, vasodilation happens and localized sweating occurs. So those are just cord reflexes. Now, if you transect the spinal cord, if you cut the spinal cord, of course, peripheral signals can no longer ascend to the higher center. So the hypothalamus is not informed of the temperature in the more distal regions, below the level of transection. And similarly, signals coming from the higher center will no longer go down to the more distal regions affected by the lesion, or below the level of transection. What you have left are just cord reflexes, but this is a weak method of temperature regulation. Now, having discussed all of these functions, the anterior and posterior hypothalamic nuclei, the posterior preoptic nucleus, vasoconstriction, vasodilation, sweating, and shivering, at the end of the day, the more powerful control system that will maintain our body temperature is our behavior. No? So for example, during warmer climates, we prefer to go out to the beach, wear light clothing, no? Naka-shorts at sando lang tayo, things like that. However, if the climate is more cold, we prefer to wear sweaters, stay indoors, sip warm cocoa or coffee, no? Things like that. So our behavior is said to be the more powerful control system in regulating our body temperature. Now let's look at the clinical aspect of body temperature. So first we have fever. Now, the normal body temperature clinically is 36.5 to 37.4. So this is a must know. So in clinical practice, this is our reference range. If our body temperature exceeds 37.4, meaning 37.5 or greater, this means the patient has fever. No? So whenever a patient comes in and complains of fever, it is imperative that we get the body temperature. No? So you get a thermometer and get the body temperature, because we all know that our skin, does not detect absolute temperatures. It can only detect degree of heat loss or heat gain. So this is not a reliable way of assessing body temperature. No? We should ask the patient, ano po yung nakuha ninyo sa thermometer? no? So if they're not able to say it, then you should get the temperature now using a thermometer. Now, fever is due to these factors. Of course, you have your pyrogens. Your pyrogens, these are your bacterial byproducts, no, bacterial fragments, endotoxins, exotoxins, etc. So all of these will set the set point high. So that will now cause fever. Other factors, you have your cytokines like your interleukin-1 and inflammatory mediators like prostaglandin. So this is the reason why antipyretics like aspirin, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, and paracetamol, they are good antipyretics because they reduce prostaglandin synthesis. Also, certain surgical procedures and tumors can cause fever. The second condition or phenomenon is chills. So this happens when the set point is high, but the body temperature is low. No? So if the set point is high and the body temperature is low, so this means that there is a sensation of cold. So the body shivers to produce heat. No? So it produces heat in order to match the set point. No? So that's chills. I'm sure all of us have experienced chills at some point. Now, in the clinical setting, it is important for us to distinguish fever and chills with the patient because sometimes patients cannot differentiate fever from chills. So they usually interchange these two concepts. No? So we should be aware that fever is the increase in body temperature, no, above normal, whereas chills, this is the shivering mechanism being activated since the set point is high or the hypothalamic set point is high. The third phenomenon is crisis, no? So during the duration of a particular illness, let's say an infection, let's say a flu, no? Crisis happens during the convalescent period. So you will notice that whenever crisis happens, the patient is slowly getting better. So what's happening is that as the disease progresses and you're within the convalescent period, the hypothalamic set point then goes down to normal, no? It goes down to normal, but the body temperature is still high. So you still have fever, no? So the body feels warm. But since the set point is low, the body will now try to find ways in order to lose heat. So that's through sweating and generalized vasodilation. That's why you will notice whenever we are sick and we start to sweat a lot, no? That's when you know you're in the recovery phase, no, of your illness. That's crisis. So if you look at the diagram here, so the red line would be the actual body temperature. The dotted blue line is the set point. So mark A or area A here. So this is when you have normal body temperature, normal set point. So you don't have the symptoms yet. However, region B, this one, this is when you have fever and chills. So fever because your body temperature is greater than normal, but your body temperature has not matched the set point. So you experience chills. So at region B, you have fever and chills. For C, this one, you only have fever. You only have fever, no? Because body temperature has already matched the set point. Now, as the illness progresses, this portion, D, is the crisis. So what happens is that the set point goes back to normal, no? But you still have increased body temperature. So during this portion, you will sweat a lot. You sweat a lot, you have vasodilation, so you're now in the crisis phase. So this happens during the convalescent period, no? So that's your disease progression, no? So from the beginning, you have your increase in body temperature and increase in set point. So you have your fever and chills. Then you have the fever portion, no, where body temperature matches the set point. And then as you go into the convalescent period, you go into the crisis phase. So the set point now goes back to normal, but you still have a gradual decline in body temperature. So body temperature is still high, no? And the body will try to lose heat through sweating and vasodilation, no? As you recover from your illness. Now, if we are constantly exposed to warm environments, no, it is important for us to be acclimatized to heat. And as we recall, aldosterone is responsible for acclimatization of our sweat glands. So recall that aldosterone maintains our extracellular fluid volume. It will maintain effective circulating volume. Whenever we are exposed to hot, humid conditions, blood vessels will dilate. So the body, should preserve extracellular and effective circulating volume. So this is done by aldosterone. So those who are exposed to warm environments for prolonged periods of time, like for example, road workers, farmers, traffic enforcers, no, they're exposed to the sun most of the time. So aldosterone production is high, no? Water reabsorption happens in the kidneys, sweat glands, in the gastrointestinal tract. So just to maintain effective circulating volume, no? So decreased loss of sodium and chloride and water, but of course the trade-off is potassium losses. So you have now a risk of developing hypokalemia. Another heat-related condition is heat stroke. So if you're exposed to warm environments for prolonged periods of time and you're not used to it, then heat stroke might set in. Now, heat stroke is potentially fatal condition. So it is important that we recognize heat stroke immediately. Now, whenever heat stroke happens, neurons are most sensitive. So there's neural damage. So symptoms typically manifest as confusion, weakness, loss of consciousness, etc. So the patient would collapse. Like for example, this one. So as a complication, no, since the higher center will lose its ability to control the body temperature, no, body temperature will now drastically rise. So the increase in body temperature will cause generalized vasodilation. So you can now have circulatory shock. So this is potentially fatal. So what we typically do as first aid, no, of course, we do not crowd the patient, no, allow ventilation, elevate the feet higher than the heart so that blood, no, from the lower extremity will go to the centralmost portion, no, so that perfusion for the more vital organs, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, would be maintained. You give fluids, cold water, you fan. If you need to remove heavy clothing, do so, no? So we need to bring the temperature down. Now, definitive management is immersing these patients to a ice water bath, no? So you need to bring the temperature down to manage heat stroke. Now let's go to extreme cold. So if you are exposed to ice water for, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes, core temperature will drop to less than 25 degrees Celsius. So when that happens, this is also potentially fatal. So you can cause fibrillation and it might result to cardiac standstill. So that's also potentially fatal. Another condition is called hypothermia. So this sets in when body temperature becomes less than 29 degrees, no? So in that regard, the neurons are also affected. So the hypothalamus will not be able to control body temperature now. So for every 20 12-degree drop in body temperature, heat production or chemical heat production drops by 2 times. So the core temperature will slowly decrease. So this will now cause hypothermia. So manifestations will also be neurologic. Sometimes early manifestations will be confusion of the patient. Sometimes it will manifest as tactile hallucinations. Like, for example, the patient might be experiencing heat instead of cold, no? As the hypothermia sets in, you'll have weakness, lethargy, and then you have this tendency to sleep. Now, should the patient sleep, no, when hypothermia sets in, that's it, no? So dire-diretso na yon, the hypothermic patient will now die, no? So it is important to keep these patients awake because the moment they sleep, they will eventually die. So the thermoregulatory mechanism of the body shuts down, so everything shuts down now. Another problem is frostbite. So this is evident in the more distal portions of our body because the body has to maintain the core temperature. So warm blood will be shunted to the more vital organs of the body, sacrificing now the more distal ones like the toes, the fingertips, the tip of the nose, the earlobes. So these are the regions where frostbite might happen. Whenever we are exposed to extremely cold environments, water within the cells might freeze. So when that happens, no, the cells become necrotic. So this is frostbite, no? Once your frostbite sets in, that's it. So they're no longer viable. No, they're no longer viable. So you have to surgically debride them. Now, cold-induced vasodilation is actually a protective mechanism to prevent frostbite. So what happens is that the anterovenous anastomosis, when exposed to extreme temperature, they do not constrict. So they remain open. No, they remain open. So this will allow warm blood from the core to go to the skin. So that prevents frostbite. That prevents freezing of water within the cells. However, that poses a risk for hypothermia because as warm blood goes to the more distal portions of our body, heat is transferred from the blood going to the skin. Now, the blood, when it goes back to the core, its temperature would be lower. So with that, core temperature might gradually go down. So you now have a risk of developing hypothermia. Another principle is artificial hypothermia. So the theory here is that if you reduce the temperature to, let's say, less than 32 degrees, the metabolism of cells or tissues will decrease. Now, this is actually being done, although not with the entire body. This is being done when we do organ transplant. So if the transplant is delayed, like let's say, for example, you will have to transport the organ, no, from the donor to the recipient. So it will take some time. We typically place these organs, no, in an ice pack so that temperature goes down, no, the metabolism decreases. So you now increase the viability of the cells or the tissues. So essentially, you're buying time. And then once you get to the recipient, then you do the transplant now. So that's artificial hypothermia. Okay, so that's our lecture in thermoregulation. This has been Dr. Ronald Alan Cruz, and have a great day.